Imagine turning on your radio tomorrow morning. Right. You're pouring your coffee, and the first voice you hear isn't your local news anchor.
Yeah, or the president or anyone you'd expect.
Exactly. It's the enemy's propaganda minister. And he is telling you that your country has just launched the largest, the most dangerous military invasion in human history.
With absolutely no warning.
Right. No official confirmation from your own government at all. Just the voice of the enemy kind of crackling through the static in the dead of night, telling you the war has reached its tipping point.
I mean, it sounds like a psychological thriller, doesn't it? But that is exactly how the American public first found out about D-Day. They literally heard it from the Germans.
It's just wild to think about. Well, it is late in the evening here, and we are broadcasting this special presentation from Chesterton Radio in Atchison, Kansas.
And it's June 6th, 2026.
Right. The air outside is quiet tonight. It's that kind of heavy, Midwestern quiet that really lets you think. So tonight, we want to invite you, sitting wherever you are listening right now, to take a journey with us.
We're doing a deep dive into something incredibly profound.
We really are. We want you to travel back in time, exactly 82 years, to another ordinary American evening, June 6th, 1944.
And we are going to explore 3 primary audio documents for this. The NBC D-Day coverage highlights, the Orson Welles D-Day program, and surprisingly, the Fibber McGee and Molly D-Day broadcast.
Yeah, we're going to try to understand what it actually felt like to hear history unfold live, sitting in the dark, just listening through a wooden speaker.
But to really do that, to actually feel it, we have to strip away the safety net of hindsight.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we look back at June 6, 1944, and we see a triumph. We know the invasion of Normandy works. We know the Allies liberate Europe.
Right, it's all carved in marble for us.
Exactly. But the people waking up to those radio broadcasts in the middle of the night didn't know that. When these broadcasts aired, the outcome was entirely unknown.
The airwaves were just thick with this genuine, terrifying suspense.
Yeah, I mean, the Allied forces were attempting an amphibious assault on a scale that had never been successfully executed in modern warfare, and against a coastline heavily fortified by the German war machine for years.
So failure wasn't just a vague fear. It was a very real, mathematically plausible possibility.
Completely.
Yeah.
And we also need to strip away our modern relationship with audio itself. Because, I mean, today audio is something you isolate yourself with.
Right. You pop earbuds in while you ride the subway or fold the laundry or whatever. It's basically background noise.
Yes. But a 1944 console radio was not a pocket device. It was this massive piece of wooden furniture. I mean, sometimes the size of a small dresser.
Like a modern fireplace, almost. It was the absolute architectural and acoustic center of the room. You didn't just listen to it, you physically gathered around it.
Well, I want you to imagine families in their living rooms, right? Lights glowing in small-town homes from coast to coast. Mothers waiting for news of fathers overseas.
Railroad workers on night shifts, farmers up before dawn. They are all tethered to the exact same invisible waves.
And that physical tethering, that shared space, is what made the delivery of this news so completely overwhelming.
Because it didn't arrive neatly at the top of the hour during some polished morning show.
No, it came the dead of night. If we look at the NBC local stations, a station like WSYR in Syracuse suddenly breaks into its off-hours programming at 12:43 in the morning.
Which is just crazy. And as we mentioned, the first reports were intercepted German announcements.
Right. And just think about the mechanics of that for a second. To get a local station on the air at 12:43 a.m. in 1944, someone physically had to be in that studio.
Right. A teletype machine in a dark newsroom just suddenly starts ringing its bells wildly.
Yeah, and an engineer has to run over and warm up the transmitter tubes. A newsman, probably in a rumpled shirt or maybe even his pajamas, runs to a microphone, flips a switch, and starts reading a raw, unverified translation of Axis propaganda.
Wow. Imagine waking out of a dead sleep, padding out to the living room, turning the heavy dial on that wooden console, and the first thing you process is the enemy claiming the slaughter has begun.
It's chilling.
Yeah.
And the profound confusion of those early hours is captured brilliantly in our sources. You are waking up, the information is completely fragmented, and human psychology instantly kicks in.
Right. Because we often think the first reaction to massive news is shock or panic or tears.
But historically, and we see it in these broadcasts, the first reaction is often a stubborn, almost aggressive disbelief.
Yes. We see this perfectly in the Orson Welles broadcast. Welles structured his entire D-Day program around a fictional narrative of a mother working the night shift at the Lockheed plant.
She's writing a letter to her child, right?
Exactly. She's working on the P-38 section assembly, the P-38 being that massive twin-engine fighter plane. She hears the news over the plant loudspeaker.
And then her shift ends.
Right, and she goes to a local Greasy Spoon diner owned by an immigrant named Mr. Fernati. And when she talks about the invasion starting, Mr. Fernati completely dismisses it. He literally calls it a fake.
He says, and this is straight from the broadcast, he goes, they make announcement yesterday invasion, the day before the telegraph it's a fake. The Germans, he sent over news that's a fake too. Gonna be laugh at us. You watch, they don't go over till September.
This is such a specific reaction.
It really is. Now, Mr. Ferrati represents a very specific psychological defense mechanism. For 2 years, America had been agonizingly waiting for the so-called Second Front. The tension was just unbearable.
Right.
So to instantly accept that the moment of maximum danger has finally arrived is just too much for his mind to process over a plate of eggs at 1 a.m.
Right.
He needs it to be a German trick, because if it's real, the casualties are going to be catastrophic.
Wait, I want to challenge that interpretation a bit, actually.
Right.
Is Mr. Fernati really displaying a subconscious psychological defense mechanism, or is he just applying cold, hard logic to a broken media environment?
Okay, that's an interesting angle.
I mean, look at what he actually says. They make announcement yesterday invasion, the day before the telegraph. He's referring to the fact that the media landscape in 1944 was absolutely flooded with rumors.
Right, false starts and botched communications.
Exactly. Wouldn't skepticism be the most rational response? The boy who cried wolf had been crying wolf for 6 months.
You know, that is a fantastic point. And it speaks directly to why the radio broadcasters had such a heavy burden that night.
Right.
Because you're right. Just days before D-Day, an Associated Press teletype operator in London had accidentally sent out a flash saying the invasion had begun.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, it was a massive blunder that sent the Allied world into a frenzy before it was finally retracted. So when the real news broke, broadcast via German sources no less, the American public was deeply cynical.
So Mr. Fernati wasn't just in denial. He was a consumer of information who had been burned before.
Exactly. It took hours of steady, somber confirmation from trusted American and British voices to pierce through that learned skepticism.
And once it did pierce through, the reaction wasn't what modern audiences might expect at all.
Not at all.
Because when we visualize the end of World War II, we naturally picture VJ Day, you know, the sailor kissing the nurse in Times Square.
The ticker tape parades, the massive crowds cheering in the streets.
Yeah, and we have a habit of bleeding that celebratory imagery backward onto D-Day. We assume that because D-Day was the beginning of the end, the news was met with immediate jubilation.
And the sources we're analyzing explicitly contradict that modern assumption. There's no cheering.
None at all. Listen to the mother in the Orson Welles broadcast. When she finally hears the official Allied confirmation, the undeniable proof, she writes in her letter, I always thought it was going to be different. I thought maybe everybody would cheer.
But they didn't.
No. And the NBC broadcast from Hollywood tells this incredibly poignant story of a Marine Corps sergeant in a nightclub in the early hours of the morning.
Oh, the jitterbugger.
Yes. This guy had just won a jitterbugging contest. He was beaming, flushed, having the absolute time of his life on the dance floor. Then the music stops. The news comes over the wire.
And what does he do?
The NBC reporter notes that the sergeant just stopped, looked around sheepishly, and muttered, I feel sort of silly.
Wow. That phrase is a gut punch. I feel sort of silly.
It really is.
It encapsulates the sudden, crushing guilt of being safe and happy while your peers are stepping off landing craft into machine gun fire.
Exactly. In Reno, Nevada, the NBC reporters noted that the wide-open gambling houses, places literally built on noise and distraction, just quietly shut their door.
And in New York City, Mayor LaGuardia didn't call his City Hall employees into his office to plan a parade. He called them in at noon for a silent prayer.
The overarching emotion of the day wasn't triumph. It was this heavy, solemn dread mixed with a grim, terrifying determination. They knew this wasn't the victory. This was the beginning of the great bloodletting.
And Orson Welles captures the sheer intimacy of how this dread spread from room to room. He gives us this vignette of an apartment building.
Oh, this scene is so good.
The mother drives home in her Chevy in the middle of the night, and she notes that her building looks strange because at 2 in the morning, every single window is lit up.
Because everybody is awake.
Right. Old Mrs. Borgerson's dog is barking relentlessly.
Well, yeah.
The Levinson's baby is crying because of all the noise, and everyone has their front doors open, playing their radios into the hallway, creating this echoing tunnel of news bulletins.
Just a wall of sound.
And in that hallway, Welles gives us a masterclass in how ordinary people cope with terror through hyperfixation. We hear Mr. Levinson arguing intensely with his neighbors about the technical, military difference between airborne troops and paratroopers.
He is getting genuinely worked up about semantics in the middle of the night.
Right. Why? Because arguing about military terminology is a distraction. If you are debating the definition of a paratrooper, you don't have to visualize the paratrooper getting shot.
Exactly. One of the neighbors finally snaps at him and says, airborne is paratroopers, paratroopers is airborne, it's all the same to me.
And then Welles drops this incredibly quiet moment that just bottoms out your stomach.
Yeah. A woman standing in that hallway quietly hopes that the paratrooper who got stuck in the plane door, which was a specific horrific detail that was actually read over the live radio broadcasts, wasn't her husband, Ned.
She just stares at the floor and says, I know Ned wouldn't want that to be him. He'd want to get there first.
Think about the localized anxiety of that hallway. It's stifling.
And that hallway is a microcosm of the entire country. The entire nation functioned that way on June 6th. They turned to the radio to bridge the impossible, terrifying gap between their quiet, safe living rooms and the violent shores of France.
The radio was the only lifeline.
Which places an unimaginable burden on the radio reporters. Let's talk about the NBC correspondents and the raw draft of history.
Yes, because these men had to convey the sheer apocalyptic scale of this invasion using nothing but their voices and a microphone.
They didn't have satellite imagery. They couldn't throw up a graphic on a screen.
Right. The NBC broadcast comes on the air and tells listeners that 4,000 ships are setting sail across the English Channel. They call it the greatest army ever to strike a hostile shore.
And the numbers they were reading regarding the air assault were simply staggering. 11,000 tons of bombs dropped on the French coast in the hours just before dawn.
I mean, a number like 11,000 tons is almost abstract. The human brain struggles to comprehend that level of destruction.
So the broadcasters had to provide context. A British air officer comes on the radio and remarks that this single night's tonnage was greater than the total amount of bombs the Germans hurled on Britain during the entire 6 months of the Great Blitz.
Wow. But the reporters still had to help Americans visualize the physical space of the front. They couldn't point to a digital map.
So they used geographic touchstones.
Yeah, the NBC reporter is describing the French coast from Cherbourg to Le Havre. And how does he explain this brutal war zone to a 1944 American audience?
He calls it a familiar route for American tourists taking the train to Paris.
He says on the air, I myself have made that railroad trip many a time. He talks about the flat country, the white cliffs near Calais. He is desperately trying to anchor this unimaginable mechanical slaughter to the memory of a pleasant pre-war European vacation.
It is a totally surreal juxtaposition. You are describing the deaths of thousands of young men by comparing the battlefield to a scenic railway tour.
It's jarring, but pedagogically, for a radio audience, it is highly effective. It gives the theater of the mind a canvas to paint on.
However, if we're talking about the theaters of mind, the most extraordinary piece of reporting in these archives isn't the studio anchoring. It is the field reporting of Wright Bryant.
Oh, the broadcast from the sky. This piece of audio is legendary.
It really is. Wright Bryant was an NBC correspondent who literally rode in a C-47 transport plane. It was designated E-7, and he was flying with the very first wave of paratroopers heading toward Normandy in the dark.
Before we get into what he actually said, we really need to pause and explain how he recorded this, because he isn't broadcasting live from the plane.
Right. The technology to transmit a live, clear audio feed from a shaking aircraft over the English Channel straight to an American living room just didn't exist.
So how did they do it?
They used an early piece of technology called a wire recorder. Before magnetic tape became the standard, reporters used these heavy, bulky machines that recorded audio magnetically onto a hair-thin spool of steel wire.
Wait, a wire recorder? Like actual metal wire?
Yes, literally a spool of steel wire. As the wire pulled past a recording head, it magnetized the sound onto the metal. But these machines were incredibly sensitive. If they got jostled too hard, the wire would snap, and you'd lose everything in a tangled mess of razor-sharp steel thread.
So Wright Bryant is sitting inside an unpressurized, freezing C-47 transport plane. The plane is vibrating violently, is taking evasive maneuvers, flak is likely bursting in the distance.
And he is huddled over this fragile, heavy wire recorder, desperately trying to keep the steel thread from snapping while speaking into a heavy microphone.
The technical miracle of this audio surviving, being flown back to London and played back over the network, is staggering.
And what he captures on that delicate steel wire are these vivid sensory details that make you feel the vibration of the aircraft. He describes the sky over England as looking like a Christmas tree.
Because the invasion armada was so massive.
Right. The planes had to keep their colored running lights on to identify themselves to friendly anti-aircraft batteries below, lest they get shot down by their own side.
He talks about the soldiers quietly taking air sickness pills. He describes the moon brightening the English Channel so much that he could clearly see the coast of France rushing up to meet them.
And then the green light flashes. The drop begins.
He actually times it. He's speaking into the mic, and he says he tried to count the seconds it took for 18 heavily armed men to jump out of the open door of an airplane flying in the dark.
He counts 101, 102, 103.
Yeah, he estimates it took maybe 11 or 12 seconds for the entire plane to empty. 12 seconds for 18 men to vanish into the night sky over Nazi-occupied France.
But it's what happens right after that drop that strips away all the mechanical awe and leaves you with raw humanity.
Yes. The story of the soldier named Isle.
Bryant reports into his microphone that during the chaotic rush to the door, one soldier, this kid named Isle, had been pushed against the door frame.
He was thrown back into the metal cabin so violently that he was momentarily dazed. The other 17 men shoved past him and jumped into the night.
And when Isle finally scrambles to his feet, the plane has already passed the drop zone. He looks at the open door, looks at the crew chief, and he begs him, "Let me go. The guys will think I'm yellow."
The guys will think I'm yellow.
The crew chief has to physically grab him and hold him back, yelling over the engine noise that it's too late, they're already over the water of the channel, and that nobody will ever think he is yellow.
Think about hearing that story on your heavy wooden radio in Ohio or Texas. This isn't a story of grand strategy or generals pushing pieces around a map.
It's the story of a terrified young man whose greatest fear in that chaotic, violent moment wasn't death. His greatest fear was letting his friends down.
That is the genius of this radio coverage. It took a global, mechanized world war and distilled it down to the most intensely personal human emotions.
Which leads perfectly to another story reported over NBC that night, the mother's parachute story.
Oh, this detail has been haunting me since I heard it. The NBC reporters told the story of a paratrooper named Robert Hillman from Hartford, Connecticut.
Right before he boarded his plane, Hillman told his commanding colonel that he wasn't worried about the jump. He said he knew his parachute was going to be perfectly okay.
And the colonel asks him why he's so confident. Hillman replies that his mother worked at the Pioneer Parachute Company back in their hometown of Hartford, and her specific job on the assembly line was giving the final, meticulous check to the silk chutes before they were packed.
Wow. This story highlights the unique power of the radio medium itself. When we watch modern war coverage, it is visually explicit. We have instantaneous high-definition video feeds from drones, helmet cams, satellites.
Right. It is graphic, it is immediate, and crucially, it leaves absolutely nothing to the imagination. You are just a passive consumer of a visual reality.
But radio required the listener to actively participate. It forced the listener's brain to paint the picture.
Yes. When you hear the story of Robert Hillman through a radio speaker, your brain instantly goes to work. You construct the image of this mother in a humid factory in Connecticut, carefully folding yards of silk, smoothing out the lines.
Completely unaware that her own hands, thousands of miles away, might literally be saving her son's life as he falls through the dark sky over Normandy.
It is the ultimate mother-to-son narrative, entirely invisible, woven directly into the fabric of a mechanical war.
And that profound need for personal connection to tie the sprawling European front to the domestic home front is what drove the local radio stations across the country to do something technically and culturally unprecedented.
Right. NBC realized they couldn't just broadcast from New York and London. They needed to capture the mood of the entire nation.
So they created a massive, interconnected listening network. They literally took the pulse of America live on the air.
NBC called it the cross-country swing. And I want to take a minute to explain how technically difficult this was in 1944.
Oh, yeah. The logistics of this were insane.
Today, if a news network wants to know what people are feeling across the country, they just pull a digital algorithm. They look at a trending hashtag on social media.
But in 1944, to create a national timeline of emotion, NBC had to physically hotwire local radio stations together using the AT&T analog long lines network.
They had engineers and switching stations manually plugging and unplugging massive copper cables to seamlessly pass the live broadcast from a studio in New York to a studio in Syracuse to Hartford down to Oklahoma.
It was a logistical high-wire act. And what that high-wire act produced was an industrial and emotional portrait of a nation in real time. Let's trace that swing.
Okay, so NBC tosses the feed to Syracuse, New York, to station WSYR. The reporter comes on the air, and the first thing he notes is that the local telephone exchanges are completely jammed.
The switchboards are lit up like Christmas trees. And who is calling the news station? It's crying mothers.
And they are asking the local newsmen impossible questions. The reporter says the mothers are calling in a panic, asking, "Is my son in this? How far behind the lines would an airplane mechanic be? Are the troops stationed in Northern Ireland taking part in the landing?"
The local newsmen, many of whom were just reading wire reports themselves, had to go on the air and act as surrogate counselors.
They had to gently, calmly explain over the broadcast that they couldn't possibly answer those specific questions, that military secrecy forbade it, and that everyone just had to wait.
The intimacy of a local radio station trying to soothe terrified parents in their broadcast radius is incredibly moving.
It really is. But then the network engineers flip the switches, and the broadcast swings to Hartford, Connecticut station WTIC, and the tone shifts on a dime.
It goes from desperate anxiety to sheer industrial fury.
Exactly. Hartford was a manufacturing hub. It was all about production.
The WTIC reporter talks about the massive Scoville manufacturing plant in Waterbury. The workers there rigged up a giant steam whistle, and every time a worker bought a $1,000 Fifth War loan bond, they blew the whistle so loud the whole town could hear it.
Let's pause and explain what a Fifth War loan bond actually was, because it sounds like they are just taking donations, but it's much deeper than that.
Right. It was a massive economic engine.
During World War II, the government needed astronomical amounts of cash to build tanks, planes, and ships. But there was another problem. Everybody at home finally had jobs after the Great Depression, but civilian goods like cars and refrigerators weren't being made anymore because all the factories were building war machines.
So you had a populace with pockets full of cash and nothing to buy.
Which is a recipe for hyperinflation. War bonds solved both problems. You pulled cash out of the civilian economy to stabilize prices, and you handed that cash directly to the military.
So buying a bond wasn't just patriotic charity. It was an aggressive economic weapon.
And the citizens treated it like a weapon. The Hartford reporter notes a high school boy in Ansonia who was late for his morning classes. Why? Because after hearing the news of D-Day, he stopped on his walk to school and personally sold $600 in war bonds to his neighbors.
In 1944 money, that is a staggering sum for a teenager to collect before first period.
Then the analog lines switched the feed down to Oklahoma City, station WKY. And this is where the logistics of the war truly closed the loop.
The reporter is at the Douglas Aircraft Plant. This is the exact factory where American workers were physically riveting together the C-47 transport planes.
The very same planes that were, at that exact moment, flying Wright Bryant and the paratroopers over the English Channel.
When the Douglas factory workers heard the news of the invasion, the reaction was explosive. The first shift of workers alone, just the morning shift, spontaneously raised $58,000 in cash for bonds in a matter of hours.
Wow. But the WKY reporter also does something vital. He interviews the women working on the assembly line.
He talks to Loretta Rummelhart and Kalita Garrison. Kalita gets on the microphone and she reveals she has 2 brothers currently serving overseas, likely taking part in the invasion.
And the reporter asks her what her reaction was to the news. Her response is so raw. She says, "I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so I did a little both. It just makes me want to work a little harder."
And that urge to bury the anxiety and grueling physical labor was echoed up in St. Paul and Minneapolis. Station KFTP reports on the iron miners in the great open pits of the Mesabi Range.
These are men doing back-breaking, dangerous labor to extract the raw steel needed for the war.
They heard the news break at 3 in the morning. And instead of staying in bed and listening to the radio, they decided, now that we're up, let's go to work. They just grabbed their heavy gear and walked out to the mines in the pitch black.
The swing finally takes us to Norfolk, Virginia station WTAR. And I love this detail because it shows how radio is creating instant experts.
Norfolk was a sleepy Navy town, and the reporter notes a lot of people actually slept through the initial civil defense sirens.
But he tells a story about riding an elevator that morning. A woman on the elevator nervously asked where exactly the landings were happening in France.
And a slinky-looking young man standing next to her suddenly snapped awake and delivered this massive, incredibly detailed, unprompted geopolitical discourse on the tidal conditions of Normandy, the defensive lines, and the strategic value of Cherbourg.
And the reporter immediately realized what was happening. The kid wasn't a military strategist. He was just reciting, almost word for word, the radio broadcasts of Robert St. John and H.V. Kaltenborn.
Kaltenborn was the legendary voice of CBS News, known for his incredibly precise, clipped delivery and deep geopolitical knowledge.
Right. This kid on the elevator had clearly stayed up all night, ear pressed to the radio, memorizing Kaltenborn's analysis, and was now downloading it to his neighbors. It perfectly illustrates how the radio armed the public with not just news, but context.
But the radio didn't just bring the voices of reporters and local citizens into the home. It brought the titans of world history directly into those living rooms, sitting them right next to the glowing dial. The broadcasts featured live, patched-in speeches from world leaders.
You hear Winston Churchill giving a live report to the House of Commons, beamed across the Atlantic. And his tone is fascinating. He isn't giving a fiery, table-pounding speech.
No. The NBC reporter accurately describes it as measured optimism. Churchill notes that the massive passage of the sea was made with far less loss than they had originally apprehended.
But he refuses to sugarcoat it. He immediately pivots, his voice heavy, to warn the public that heavy fighting will soon begin and that it will continue without end. He is preparing them for the telegrams.
Then you have the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. During his radio broadcast on June 6th, which was primarily a prayer that we will discuss deeply later on, it was revealed that FDR actually knew the exact date and time of D-Day the night before.
On June 5th, FDR had given a national radio address celebrating the fall of Rome to the Allies. Let's unpack the media strategy of that for a second.
It's remarkable.
Why did FDR keep the greatest military secret in history completely hidden while he was live on the radio addressing the nation on June 5th? Part of it is obvious: military security. You don't tip off the Germans.
But there is also a masterful understanding of media pacing and psychological impact. He lets the nation celebrate the liberation of Rome. He lets them have that victory.
All while carrying the immense crushing burden of knowing that as he speaks into the microphone about Italy, an armada of thousands of ships is silently crossing the dark channel toward France. The restraint required to not utter a word of it is phenomenal.
The broadcasters also painted a vivid picture of the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. They described his hidden trailer headquarters in the woods of England.
They detailed how, for 48 agonizing hours, Eisenhower had been staring at the sky watching a massive storm system. He actually had to make the terrifying call to delay the invasion from June 5th to June 6th because of the weather, knowing the delay could compromise the entire operation.
And the NBC reporter points out a heartbreaking, deeply human coincidence. Eisenhower's son, John, was graduating from West Point on D-Day.
His wife, Mamie, was sitting in the bleachers in New York watching their son get his diploma, while her husband was sitting in a damp trailer across the world, sending thousands of other people's sons onto the bloody beaches of Normandy.
The radio took the burden of leadership, which is usually abstract and distant, and localized it. It made these historical figures feel intensely, painfully human to the American listener.
Now, as the day progressed, the networks faced a massive programming dilemma. All day, they had been broadcasting wall-to-wall news. But at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time, millions of Americans tuned their dials expecting their regular scheduled programming. Specifically, NBC's hit comedy show, Fibber McGee and Molly.
To understand the weight of what happens next, we have to contextualize Fibber McGee and Molly. This wasn't just a popular show, it was an absolute juggernaut of American domestic comedy.
It pulled in tens of millions of listeners every week. People tuned in to laugh, to escape the rationing and the stress of the war, and to hear the familiar running gags like Fibber opening his famously overstuffed hall closet and an avalanche of junk pouring out.
It was a pillar of the American week. But on the night of June 6, 1944, the famous closet stayed shut. The jokes were entirely gone.
The announcer, Harlow Wilcox, comes on the air and says, "Having canceled all regularly scheduled programs, NBC invites you to listen tonight to Fibber McGee and Molly and a special Invasion Day program."
And then Fibber McGee, the character, played by Jim Jordan, steps up to the microphone. But he drops the wacky comedy persona entirely. He speaks in a somber, steady voice and tells the audience that they are setting aside the laughs tonight to bring news bulletins and music dedicated to the fighting forces.
Wait, I have to stop you there, because looking at it through a modern lens, it seems absolutely insane.
Oh, totally.
Imagine if today a massive global conflict broke out, World War III begins. Do you think a streaming platform or a major network would cancel a massive comedy special right in the middle of its premiere, but keep the stand-up comedian on the screen looking deadly serious to guide the audience through the nuclear news bulletins?
People would riot. They'd demand a serious news anchor.
Right, so why on earth did NBC think Fibber McGee, a fictional sitcom character, was the right guy to anchor a national crisis?
That is exactly the right question to ask, because it highlights how different the parasocial relationship with radio was in 1944. You're right. Today, we demand hyper-professionalized news anchors in sleek studios for crises. But in the 1940s, radio voices were guests in your home.
Ah, so they were psychological anchors.
Exactly. Fibber McGee and Molly weren't just entertainers. They were, in the minds of the audience, reliable, comforting friends who sat in the living room every Tuesday night. If NBC had just played a continuous, disembodied feed of terrifying news bulletins from a stiff anchor in New York, the panic would have skyrocketed.
I see.
When Fibber McGee and Molly, the most familiar, stable voices in America, set aside their usual antics, it signaled to the audience that the entire nation was pausing together. It was a form of profound communal solidarity. The underlying message was, yes, the world has shifted on its axis today, but your friends are still here with you in the dark.
And they didn't just read dry news copy. They used their airtime to facilitate a musical liturgy. They had Billy Mills and his orchestra play specifically chosen, deeply resonant pieces.
We hear the Song of the Merchant Marine, honoring the dangerous, unglamorous supply lines crossing the Atlantic. The King's Men, a vocal quartet, sing a solemn song called This Is Worth Fighting For.
And the broadcast closes with the sweeping, majestic Army hymn.
The inclusion of music here is a brilliant piece of cognitive pacing. The human brain can only absorb raw, traumatic data bulletins about beachheads, casualty estimates, counterattacks for so long before it becomes numb or overwhelmed. It hits a saturation point.
Right, you just shut down.
Exactly. The music provided a structured, necessary emotional release. It gave the listener a moment to breathe, to cry, to process the terror of the news bulletin before the next one hit. When the announcer dedicates a song to the men who man the long sea lanes to victory, it transforms a standard news broadcast into a national memorial service happening in real time in millions of living rooms simultaneously.
While comedy paused to offer that solemn musical liturgy, another genre stepped up to help Americans process the overwhelming emotions of the day: drama.
Right. Orson Welles.
Yes. Orson Welles, known as the absolute master of the radio medium, took a completely different approach from the NBC newsmen. Instead of relying on hard facts and bulletins, Welles used fiction as a vehicle for truth.
We have to remember Welles' history here. 6 years prior, in 1938, Welles directed the infamous War of the Worlds broadcast. He knew, better than anyone alive, the terrifying, visceral power of the radio to induce mass panic by blurring the line between reality and fiction.
For D-Day, he inverted that power. He used a fictional narrative not to panic the country, but to deeply comfort it.
And his media strategy for doing that is fascinating. He didn't just get on the mic and read a booming monologue himself, even though he had one of the most famous voices in the world. Instead, he casts Agnes Moorehead, one of the greatest radiators of her time, to play the role of the Lockheed factory worker we mentioned earlier.
And why did he choose a female factory worker as his proxy? Because Welles understood his demographics. He knew that the primary audience sitting at home listening to the radio during those long daytime and late-night hours were women. The men were deployed or working heavy industrial shifts.
By centering the broadcast on a mother, he created a direct, empathetic conduit for the specific strain of survivors' guilt, anxiety, and domestic exhaustion that his actual listeners were feeling.
The broadcast is framed entirely as this mother writing a letter to her baby child, Robert, or perhaps Dorothy, she notes at the end, if the baby turns out to be a girl, about the day the invasion began.
She is creating a historical document within a historical document.
She says to the child, I know I haven't had anything special to say. I've just been one of the millions and millions waiting at home and listening to the radio.
Welles is validating the passive experience of the listener. He is saying, your waiting is also part of this history. It perfectly bridges the gap between grand historical events, what General Eisenhower famously called the Great Crusade, and the mundane reality of ordinary domestic life.
It's incredibly grounding. In the letter, she talks about the steak at the diner being a little tough and the streetcars being crowded. But she quickly, almost guiltily adds, nobody out here sleeps in a bomb shelter. She is openly grappling with the guilt of American geographic safety.
And then there's this beautiful, quiet vignette where she and her friend Lillian decide to cancel their beauty parlor appointments.
Yes. They were scheduled to get their hair done, but after hearing the news, they realize how trivial it is. So instead, they go down to the local registry and sign up to be nurses' aides part-time.
That one tiny, fictionalized detail, canceling a beauty parlor appointment, tells you more about the psychological shift on the American home front than a dozen statistics about war bond sales. It represents the voluntary surrender of personal vanity in the face of immense collective sacrifice. Welles understood that history is lived in the small moments.
But Welles was too smart to just keep the broadcast relentlessly somber. He captures the surreal, almost absurd reality of living through a world war by contrasting the solemnity of the home front with the bizarre, almost comedic stories coming over the wire.
The mother writes in her letter about a news story that actually made her smile that day. A Brooklyn G.I. Joe marching into newly liberated Rome who decides to stand on Benito Mussolini's famous balcony and do double talk to a cheering Italian crowd.
The image of an American kid from Brooklyn mocking the theatrical, chest-puffing fascism of Mussolini from his own balcony is incredibly potent. It's a massive release of tension.
And for those who might not know the vaudeville term, double talk is a specific type of comedic routine where the speaker mixes real, authoritative-sounding words with complete gibberish.
So you have this American teenager in a combat uniform doing a vaudeville gibberish routine where a dictator used to declare war and the newly freed Italians are cheering him on. It's beautiful.
Welles immediately juxtaposes that cathartic humor with the bizarre propaganda coming from the enemy. He quotes the official Japanese radio broadcast from that day, which aggressively claimed the Allied invasion was highly welcome and that there was widespread jubilation in the German high command upon receiving the news that the Allies had landed.
Which is patently absurd. The Germans were fighting for their lives. But it highlights the surreal, fractured nature of the information war. People sitting at home in 1944 were parsing through dry Allied bulletins, absurd Axis propaganda, wild local rumors, and their own deep-seated fears, desperately trying to construct a coherent reality.
It is striking how seamlessly the radio wove all these threads together. Deeply personal anxiety, grand geopolitical theater, the absurdities of vaudeville comedy, the heavy machinery of war.
One minute you're hearing about a mother in Connecticut checking a parachute, the next you hear the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and the next you hear about a GI doing double talk in Rome. And it is all pouring out of the exact same wooden box, vibrating the air in your living room.
As the night deepens in our timeline and the broadcast day of June 6 winds down, I think it's important to reflect on these broadcasts through a broader lens. Broadcasting from Chesterton Radio tonight, we look at the overarching themes of June 6, 1944, and what emerges is a profound, almost spiritual documentation of duty and ordinary heroism.
Ordinary heroism is the perfect phrase, because when you listen to these primary sources, the heroes that the broadcasters focus on aren't just the generals with the stars on their shoulders moving flags on a map.
No. The heroes are the Yaqui and Cherokee demolition engineers who parachuted in with the very first wave, utilizing their ancestral stealth, as a reporter specifically noted, for modern mechanized warfare.
The heroes are the iron miners in Minnesota who hear the news at 3 in the morning and say, let's go to work. The heroes are the mothers checking parachutes and the high school kids hawking bonds on the sidewalk. The broadcasts validate the dignity of ordinary labor applied to a monumental cause.
And there's another theme that runs powerfully through these recordings. It's the theme of patriotism without hatred.
This is a crucial distinction. It is most vividly captured in the NBC broadcast when the famous actor Ronald Colman comes on the air to read a poem. It was written explicitly for that broadcast day by Edna St. Vincent Millay, and it was titled Poem and Prayer for an Invading Army.
Millay was a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, and her words here are staggering. She addresses the workers at home first, the miners, the farmers, the shipyard workers, telling them that they are the ones fitting wings to metal birds. But the core of her prayer is what happens after the war is won.
She prays for the returning soldiers, and her explicit, desperate plea is that when these boys come home, they do not find the monster they fought waiting for them at their own tables.
The exact lines she wrote are chilling. She warns the American public that the returning soldiers must not find seated at their own tables, at the head perhaps of the long festive board very monster which they sailed forth to conquer and to quell.
And she specifically names that monster. She calls on the nation to forever forget words like hatred, bitterness, rancor, greed, intolerance, bigotry.
In the very hour that American boys are bleeding and dying on the beaches of Normandy, fighting to crush a fascist regime, one of America's greatest poets goes on national radio and declares that the enemy isn't just a uniform over there. The enemy is the concept of hatred and bigotry itself. And if the American public lets those concepts live in their own homes, the military victory means nothing.
The prevailing emotion broadcast over the radio that day wasn't jingoism. It wasn't blind, foaming hatred for the German soldier. It was a solemn, burdensome sense of duty and a desperate hope for a lasting peace. As FDR put it in his own broadcast, they were fighting for a peace invulnerable to the schemings of unworthy men.
Which brings us to the most unifying moments of the broadcast day. Throughout June 6th, the entire nation became what we can only describe as a national congregation. The radio ceased being a news box and acted as a cathedral.
We hear Chaplain Brigadier General William R. Arnold broadcast a solemn prayer asking God to shed light on the men fighting for liberty. We hear the King of England broadcasting an incredibly humble plea across the globe saying, "We shall not ask that God may do our will, but that we may be enabled to do the will of God."
And then, at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, comes on the air. He doesn't give a triumphant, chest-beating speech. He leads the nation in a prayer that he wrote himself. He says, "Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor."
A struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. He warns the country that the road ahead will be long and incredibly hard, that the darkness will be rent by noise and flame.
He explicitly asks for stoutness to their hearts and acknowledges with brutal honesty that some of those boys will never return.
If we look at the incredible tapestry of these sources, the raw, chaotic news bulletins, the domestic comedy giving way to solemn music, the poetry, the national prayers, you can make a very strong argument that D-Day represented radio's greatest hour.
It wasn't just informing the public. It was comforting, uniting, and inspiring a vast, frightened community, simultaneously holding the hands of millions of people in the dark.
Which brings us back to where we started tonight. It is late. The broadcast day of June 6, 1944 is finally winding down. I want you, listening right now, to imagine the lights slowly clicking off in those homes across America. From right here in Atchison, Kansas, to Syracuse, New York, to Oklahoma City, to a small apartment hallway in Hollywood.
The voices on the radio finally say goodnight. But the hum of the vacuum tubes remains. The reality of that night as the lights went out was stark. Some of those sleeping families would eventually receive good news, a telegram saying their son was safe.
Some would receive terrible news, the dreaded telegram from the War Department, delivered by a quiet boy on a bicycle. But on that specific night, the night of June 6th, most of them simply had to wait. They had to lay their heads on their pillows, listen to the low static of the radio, and wait for the dawn.
We look back on them today with a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the young men who crossed that turbulent English Channel into the teeth of machine gun fire, and gratitude for the familiar, steady radio voices that carried the immense weight of history into American homes, providing anchor in the storm.
It leaves us with a final thought to ponder as we turn off our own devices tonight. We live in an age where we can instantly see everything happening everywhere in the world. We have high-definition video in the palms of our hands 24 hours a day. But in gaining all that instant sight, have we lost the profound, unifying empathy that comes from sitting quietly together in the dark, listening to a single voice and having to imagine the rest?